Rome, 38 AD. The marble corridors of the imperial palace echoed with whispered scandals and hushed conspiracies, but none would compare to the storm that was about to engulf the empire in the form of one woman, Valeria Messalina. "She's barely 16, Caesar," the advisor whispered nervously to Emperor Claudius, his voice trembling in the shadows of the great hall. "Are you certain about this marriage?" Claudius, stammering as he often did, replied with determination that surprised even himself. She is of noble blood. The marriage will strengthen our position." Little did he know he was sealing not just a political alliance, but the fate of his empire. Born into the prestigious Valeria family, Messalina possessed beauty that could launch 1,000 ships and ambition that could sink them all. Her dark eyes held secrets even then, and her smile promised both pleasure and peril. The young bride entered the imperial household not as a meek wife, but as a predator disguised in silk and jewels. The transformation began almost immediately after her marriage to Claudius in 38 AD. "My dear husband," she would purr, her fingers tracing the purple stripe of his toga, "surely the emperor deserves more excitement in his life?" Claudius, scholarly and often naive, interpreted her words as wifely devotion. He had no idea he had married a volcano disguised as a flower. Within months of becoming empress, Messalina discovered the intoxicating taste of power. She didn't merely want to influence, she wanted to control. "Bring me Senator Valerius," she commanded her servants one evening, her voice carrying the authority of Caesar himself. When the confused servant hesitated, her eyes flashed dangerously. "Did I stutter? The senator will visit me tonight, or he'll find his estates confiscated by morning." The senator arrived, trembling and confused. Messalina received him in her private chambers, draped in the finest silk that left little to imagination. "Senator," she began, her voice honey over steel, "I have a proposition that will benefit us both greatly." What followed was the first of countless encounters where political favors were traded for intimate pleasures, where the empress used her body as currency and her bedroom as a senate floor. News of her behavior spread through Rome like wildfire through dry wheat. In the taverns, citizens whispered in hushed, scandalized tones, "They say she receives more men in one night than the goddess Venus herself." But these were not mere rumors, they were carefully orchestrated political maneuvers disguised as debauchery. Messalina understood something that escaped many of her predecessors. In Rome, information was more valuable than gold, and compromise more powerful than armies. Every senator who visited her chambers left behind not just his dignity but his secrets, his weaknesses, and ultimately his loyalty. She was building an empire within the empire, one conquered bed at a time. "The Empress grows too bold," Senator Marcus confided to his colleague in the baths. "Yesterday she summoned 3 of us simultaneously. The woman has no shame." His friend nodded gravely, not knowing that every word was being carefully reported back to Messalina's extensive network of spies and informants. But Messalina's appetites extended far beyond political manipulation. History tells us that she would often disguise herself at night, donning the clothes of a common woman, and venturing into the Suburra, Rome's most notorious district. There, in the smoky, wine-soaked brothels, she would compete with the city's most experienced prostitutes. "You cannot be serious," gasped Locusta, one of Rome's most famous courtesans, when the disguised empress challenged her to a contest of endurance. "I've serviced senators, generals, even members of the Praetorian Guard." Messalina smiled that dangerous smile of hers. "And I've serviced the empire itself, darling. Shall we see who truly knows the art of pleasure?" The contest that followed became the stuff of legend. Ancient historians, though perhaps prone to exaggeration, recorded that Messalina would outlast seasoned professionals, taking on client after client, while her competitors collapsed from exhaustion. Whether driven by insatiable desire or calculating political strategy, she had turned the oldest profession into her personal battlefield. 25, she would whisper triumphantly to her servant as dawn broke over the 7 hills. 25 conquests in a single night. Even Cleopatra couldn't claim such victories. Her servant, long since numbed to her mistress's escapades, simply nodded and prepared the empress's bath and cosmetics for her return to palace life. By day, she was the picture of imperial dignity. Draped in purple silk and adorned with pearls from the Red Sea, she would glide through the palace corridors as if she hadn't spent the previous night engaged in activities that would make a gladiator blush. "Good morning, my beloved husband," she would coo to Claudius, pressing a chaste kiss to his cheek while her body still carried the scent of her nocturnal adventures. Claudius, absorbed in his historical writings and administrative duties, remained blissfully unaware of his wife's double life. "Messalina seems unusually content lately," he remarked to his secretary Narcissus one morning. Narcissus, who had begun to piece together the truth, chose his words carefully. "Indeed, Caesar, the Empress appears to have found many sources of fulfillment in Rome." As her confidence grew, so did her audacity. Messalina began to see herself not merely as Empress, but as a goddess of desire who could bend anyone to her will. She started hosting elaborate parties in the palace that blurred the lines between political gatherings and orgies. Senators found themselves in compromising positions they never intended, while Messalina collected blackmail material like other women collected jewelry. "Senator Flavius," she would whisper into the ear of a married politician, "your wife need never know about tonight's discussions, as long as you remember to vote correctly on the grain subsidies tomorrow." The senator, caught between political survival and personal shame, would invariably choose his career over his conscience. Her network of corruption grew like a spider's web throughout the imperial administration. No decision was made, no appointment confirmed, no law passed without Messalina's invisible hand guiding the outcome. She had achieved what no Roman woman before her had managed, absolute power disguised as absolute pleasure. But power, especially power built on such foundations, inevitably creates enemies. Freedman Narcissus, Claudius's trusted secretary, began to document evidence of the Empress's activities. "This cannot continue," he confided to his fellow freedman Pallas. "She's turning the empire into her personal pleasure palace. Someone must warn Caesar." Yet even as opposition gathered against her, Messalina's appetite for risk only intensified. The thrill of danger became as intoxicating as the power itself. She began to take increasingly dangerous chances, almost as if she were daring the gods themselves to stop her. The breaking point came when Messalina decided that even marriage to an emperor was insufficient for her ambitions. She had heard whispers that Claudius's health was failing, and she began to position herself for what would come next. But instead of playing the role of grieving widow, she chose a path so audacious that it would ultimately seal her fate. "Gaius Silius," she whispered to the handsome young senator, "you are the most beautiful man in Rome, and I am the most powerful woman. Surely the gods intend us to be together?" Silius, already under her spell, could only nod as she outlined her most dangerous plan yet. In the summer of 48 AD, while Emperor Claudius was away in Ostia overseeing the construction of the new port, Messalina committed an act so shocking that it reverberated through history. She married Gaius Silius in a public ceremony. Not a secret affair, not a private indulgence, but a formal marriage complete with witnesses, contracts, and religious rites. "Are you mad?" gasped the priest, who was forced to conduct the ceremony. "The emperor still lives. This is treason." But Messalina, drunk on power and possibility, laughed like a woman who believed herself untouchable. "The old fool will never know, and if he does, what can he do? Half the Senate owes me favors, and the other half fears me." The wedding feast that followed was a spectacle of excess that would have impressed even Caligula. Senators danced naked, matrons discarded their stolas for flower garlands, and wine flowed like the Tiber in flood season. At the center of it all sat Messalina, no longer merely an empress but a self-proclaimed goddess of desire and power. "To the new Caesar," toasted Silius, raising his cup to his bride. The assembled guests, many too terrified to refuse, echoed the toast. But their voices trembled, for they all understood that they were witnessing either the birth of a new dynasty or the final act of a tragedy. News of the marriage reached Ostia within hours, carried by breathless messengers who had ridden their horses to death in their haste. Narcissus, who received the report, felt his blood turn to ice. "Caesar," he said, bursting into Claudius's presence without ceremony, "we must return to Rome immediately. The empire itself hangs in the balance." When Claudius heard the news, the scholarly emperor, who rarely raised his voice, roared with a fury that shook the very walls. She has married another? While I live." His stammer disappeared in his rage, replaced by the voice of a man who suddenly understood that he had been made a fool of by the woman he loved. The ride back to Rome was like a military campaign. Claudius, accompanied by the Praetorian Guard, thundered through the countryside while messengers rode ahead to secure the loyalty of key military commanders. The scholarly emperor had vanished, replaced by a descendant of Julius Caesar who would not tolerate such betrayal. Meanwhile, in Rome, the wedding celebration continued for days. Messalina, perhaps believing her own propaganda about her invincibility, seemed genuinely surprised when reports arrived of her husband's return. "Let him come," she declared, wine making her reckless. "I am no longer his property. I belong to Silius now, and through him I shall rule Rome as it was meant to be ruled." But as the reports grew more urgent, even Messalina's allies began to desert her.
Senators who had been eager participants in her schemes suddenly remembered pressing business in distant provinces. The freedmen who had carried her messages found themselves mysteriously unavailable. The great network of corruption and compromise that had sustained her began to collapse like a house built on sand. "My lady," her personal servant whispered urgently, "perhaps it would be wise to seek sanctuary in the temple of Vesta. The emperor's guard is already in the city." For the first time in years, Messalina felt something she had almost forgotten: genuine fear. Salius, the handsome young senator who had seemed so confident during the marriage ceremony, now paced like a caged animal. "What have we done?" he muttered, running his hands through his hair. "We've committed treason against Caesar himself. They'll crucify us both." As Claudius entered Rome, the city fell silent. Citizens shuttered their windows and barred their doors. The emperor, who had been mocked for his stammer and his scholarly interests, now radiated the cold fury of absolute power. There would be no mercy, no negotiation, no escape. The confrontation, when it came, was swift and brutal. Messalina, still clinging to delusions of her own invincibility, was found in the gardens of Lucullus, surrounded by the last few supporters who hadn't yet fled. "Claudius," she called out as the Praetorian guard surrounded her, "surely we can discuss this like civilized people." But the man who approached her was not the stammering, gentle scholar she had married. This was Caesar incarnate, terrible in his righteousness. You dare speak my name after what you have done? You who have made me a laughingstock throughout the empire." Messalina fell to her knees, suddenly understanding that her charm, her beauty, her sexual power, none of it mattered now. "Please," she whispered, tears streaming down her face, "I am the mother of your children. Surely that must count for something." Claudius looked down at the woman who had been his wife, his partner, his greatest mistake. You are the mother of my children," he said slowly, "and that is the only reason you will die quickly." The execution was swift. As the sun set over the 7 hills of Rome, Valeria Messalina, once the most powerful woman in the empire, breathed her last. Silius had already been dispatched, along with the handful of conspirators who hadn't managed to flee the city in time.
In the aftermath, as Rome slowly returned to normal, citizens whispered about the Empress, who had dared too much. Some called her a monster, others a victim of her own desires. But all agreed on one thing: never before had one woman wielded such power through such means, and never before had such power led to such a spectacular fall. Claudius, shaken by the betrayal, withdrew into his studies and administrative duties. He would marry once more, to his niece Agrippina, but he would never again trust so completely or love so blindly. The scholar emperor had learned that even knowledge of human nature could not protect against the depths of human ambition. The story of Messalina became a cautionary tale told throughout the empire. In the brothels of the Suburra, prostitutes would joke grimly about the empress who had tried to outsin them all. In the Senate, politicians would invoke her name when warning against the dangers of unchecked ambition. In the palace, servants would cross themselves when passing through the chambers where she had once held court. But perhaps the most fitting epitaph for Valeria Messalina came from an unexpected source. Years later, when the historian Tacitus wrote his account of her life and death, he concluded with words that captured both her magnificent audacity and her ultimate tragedy. She possessed beauty that could topple empires and ambition that knew no bounds. In another age, with different circumstances, she might have been remembered as a great queen. Instead, she chose to be remembered as Rome's most scandalous empress. But the true scale of Messalina's empire of corruption only became clear in the days following her death. As Narcissus and the other freedmen sifted through her personal effects and secret correspondence, they discovered a network of influence that extended far beyond what anyone had imagined. "Caesar," Narcissus reported to Claudius, his voice heavy with disbelief, "we've found letters, hundreds of them. She was blackmailing half the patrician families in Rome. The documents revealed a systematic operation of sexual entrapment and political coercion that would have impressed even the most cunning spy master. Letters written in Messalina's own hand detailed her methods with clinical precision. Senator Crassus responds well to flattery and wine. His weakness for young slaves can be exploited. Arrange a gathering." Another read: "The governor of Syria requires more direct persuasion. Send him the blonde from Gaul. She speaks Greek and knows exactly what information we need." The scope of her activities staggered even her enemies. She had maintained detailed records of every senator's vices, every merchant's illegal dealings, every general's battlefield failures. Her bedroom hadn't just been a place of pleasure, it had been the unofficial intelligence headquarters of the empire. "Look at this," whispered Pallas, holding up a scroll with trembling hands.
She was planning to replace half the Senate with her own candidates, and here a list of Praetorian officers who had sworn secret loyalty to her. By the gods, she was planning a complete takeover. The investigation revealed that Messalina's network extended throughout the empire. In Alexandria, she had cultivated relationships with grain merchants who could starve Rome if necessary. In Gaul, she had seduced the wives of tribal chieftains to ensure their husbands' loyalty. In Germania, she had planted her lovers among the auxiliary commanders. She wasn't just collecting men, Claudius said slowly, the full horror dawning on him. She was collecting the empire itself, one body, one secret, one compromise at a time. The aftermath of her death sent shockwaves through every level of Roman society. Senators who had seemed untouchable found themselves under investigation. Wealthy merchants discovered their trade licenses under review. Even some Praetorian officers faced court-martial as the extent of Messalina's influence became clear. "Please," begged Senator Lucius Vitellius, throwing himself at Claudius's feet. "I was drunk. I didn't know what I was agreeing to. The Empress, she had ways of making men forget themselves." Claudius looked down at the groveling senator with disgust. "You forgot." The trials that followed became known as the Great Purification. Dozens of senators, hundreds of equestrians, and countless freedmen faced charges ranging from treason to corruption to moral turpitude. Some fled to distant provinces, others fell on their swords rather than face public disgrace. A few, the clever ones, had kept detailed records of their own, turning state's evidence in exchange for clemency. "She made us all complicit," wept the wife of a disgraced senator. "My husband would return from those gatherings changed, haunted. He would drink until dawn, muttering about things that couldn't be undone. She didn't just corrupt their bodies, she poisoned their souls." The economic impact of Messalina's death rippled through the empire. Merchants who had relied on her protection found their goods confiscated. Trade routes that had operated under her blessing were suddenly subject to imperial scrutiny. The brothels of the Suburra, once protected by her patronage, faced raids and closures. "The Empress was our guardian angel," sobbed Lydia, one of the courtesans who had witnessed Messalina's legendary contests. "She understood us. She protected us from the harsh laws, from the violent clients, from the tax collectors. Now we're nothing again, just whores to be used and discarded." But perhaps most shocking of all were the discoveries made in Messalina's private apartments. Hidden behind false walls and concealed beneath floorboards, investigators found a treasure trove that revealed the true extent of her avarice. Gold coins from Parthia, silks from India, pearls from Britain, tribute from lovers who had sought to buy her favor with exotic gifts. "This necklace," marveled Narcissus, holding up a string of emeralds the size of grapes, "it's from the king of Nubia. And this dagger, pure silver inlaid with Egyptian gold." She wasn't just collecting political power, she was building a personal fortune that rivaled the imperial treasury. More disturbing were the personal items that told the story of her psychological state. Mirrors everywhere, dozens of them, reflecting her image back from every angle. Cosmetics from every corner of the known world, including some that contained dangerous substances like lead and mercury. And strangest of all, a collection of death masks, faces of the lovers who had died under suspicious circumstances. "She kept trophies," whispered the slave who had been forced to maintain these grisly souvenirs. When a man displeased her or threatened to expose her secrets, he would disappear, and then his face would join her collection. She would sometimes sit among them for hours, talking to them as if they were still alive. The psychological profile that emerged painted a picture of a woman driven by compulsions far beyond normal human desire. Palace physicians, when questioned, revealed that Messalina had consulted them about various potions and substances, some to enhance desire, others to prevent pregnancy, and still others whose purposes they dared not speculate about. "She asked me once about nightshade," recalled the court physician, his voice barely above a whisper. "Not enough to kill quickly," she said, "but enough to induce compliance. I refused, of course, but I fear she found other sources for such knowledge."
As the investigation deepened, it became clear that Messalina's final marriage to Silius had not been an act of passion, but the culmination of a carefully orchestrated plan. Documents revealed that she had been systematically poisoning Claudius with small doses of various substances, not enough to kill him, but enough to weaken his mind and make him more pliable to her suggestions. "The trembling in his hands," reported the palace taster who had been secretly monitoring the imperial meals. "It wasn't age or nervousness. She was slowly killing him, making it look like natural decline. A few more months, and she would have been regent for her son, with Silius as her partner in power." The revelation that she had been slowly murdering her own husband while sharing his bed sent shockwaves through Roman society. It wasn't just adultery or political ambition, it was something far more sinister. Messalina had been playing a game so complex and ruthless that even Rome's most cynical politicians were left speechless. She was going to kill Caesar, Narcissus repeated to himself, as if saying it aloud would make it more believable. Not in a moment of passion, not in a fit of rage, but slowly, methodically, over months and years, while smiling at him, while bearing his children, while pretending to love him. The children themselves, Britannicus and Octavia, became tragic figures in the aftermath. Too young to understand the full scope of their mother's crimes, they were nevertheless tainted by association. Claudius, despite his rage at Messalina, found himself torn between his love for his children and his revulsion at how they had been conceived and raised. "They are innocent," he would mutter to himself in the long nights after Messalina's death. "But how can I look at them without seeing her face? How can I raise them without wondering what poison she may have already placed in their minds?" The cultural impact of the Messalina affair extended far beyond politics and economics. Roman moralists seized upon her story as the ultimate example of what happened when women were given too much freedom and power. Satirists wrote scathing poems about the Empress who had out-whored the whores. Philosophers debated whether her behavior was the result of inherent female wickedness or the corruption of absolute power. "She represents everything that is wrong with our modern age," declared Seneca in a speech to the Senate. "When women abandon their natural role as guardians of virtue and instead pursue the vices traditionally associated with men, the very foundations of civilization crumble." But there were other voices, quieter and more thoughtful, that saw something different in Messalina's story. A few scholars, writing years later when passions had cooled, suggested that her behavior might have been a rational response to the impossible position in which Roman women, even imperial ones, found themselves. "Consider," wrote one anonymous chronicler, "that she was married at 16 to a man 30 years her senior, expected to produce heirs while having no real power over her own fate. Perhaps her sexual adventures were not mere debauchery, but a desperate attempt to claim some agency in a world that offered her none." The impact on Roman women was profound and lasting. New laws were passed restricting the movements and activities of aristocratic women. The famous dinner parties and cultural salons that had been features of upper-class life were subjected to imperial oversight. Even the innocent gatherings of wives and daughters were viewed with suspicion. "We are all prisoners now," complained Antonia, the wife of a senator, to her friend. "Thanks to that woman's excesses, we cannot so much as visit the baths without a guard reporting our conversations to the palace. She has made us all suspects in our own homes." The economic consequences continued to unfold for years. Trade agreements that had been secured through Messalina's network of corruption collapsed, leading to shortages of luxury goods and disruptions in commercial shipping. The brothel industry, which had flourished under her protection, was decimated by the subsequent crackdowns. "Business has never recovered," lamented the owner of one of the Sabura's more upscale establishments. The Empress understood that pleasure is a commodity like any other. It needs regulation, protection, quality control. These new administrators see only vice where she saw opportunity. Perhaps most tragically, many of the reforms and improvements that Messalina had genuinely championed were swept away in the moral panic that followed her death. She had been a patron of the arts, funding poets and playwrights, whose works were now banned as corrupted by association with her. She had supported legislation improving conditions for slaves, particularly female slaves, subject to sexual abuse, laws that were quickly repealed by senators eager to distance themselves from her legacy. She was not all evil, one brave historian would write decades later. In her corruption there were seeds of genuine reform. In her vice there were moments of real compassion. History will judge her harshly, but history should also remember that she lived in harsh times that offered few choices to women of ambition. The mystery of Messalina's true motivations would continue to fascinate historians for centuries. Some saw her as a monster of depravity, others as a victim of circumstances beyond her control. Still others suggested that she had been, in her way, a revolutionary, a woman who had tried to overturn the established order, not through traditional means of rebellion, but through the only weapons available to her: sexuality, charm, and the ruthless exploitation of male weakness. "She understood something that the philosophers miss," reflected one of her former lovers, speaking anonymously years later. "Power isn't just about armies and laws, it's about knowing what people want and being willing to provide it. She gave men what they craved and took from them what she needed. In a world ruled by force, she chose to rule by desire." The investigation into her network revealed connections that stretched far beyond Rome's borders. She had maintained correspondence with Queen Dido of Carthage, sharing intelligence about Roman military movements in exchange for African ivory and gold.
She had cultivated relationships with Germanic chieftains, trading sexual favors for information about tribal alliances that could threaten Roman frontiers. She was conducting her own foreign policy, Narcissus realized as he read through her private papers. While Caesar focused on his histories and his public works, she was building her own empire through bedchamber diplomacy. If she had succeeded in eliminating him, she would have ruled not just Rome, but half the known world. The psychological toll on those who had been caught in her web was severe and lasting. Many of the men who had been her lovers never fully recovered from the experience. Some retreated from public life entirely, haunted by memories of what they had been forced to do to maintain her favor. Others became obsessively religious, seeking purification through extreme devotion to the gods. "She changed me," confessed one former senator, speaking to his priest in the temple of Jupiter. "Not just what I did with her, but what I became because of her. She showed me depths of degradation I never knew existed within myself. How does a man live with that knowledge?" The servants and slaves who had facilitated her activities faced their own reckoning. Some were executed as accomplices, others sold to distant provinces where they could do no further harm. A few, the ones who had kept detailed records of her activities, were rewarded with freedom and citizenship in exchange for their testimony. "I saw everything," whispered one former slave girl who had served in Messalina's private chambers. "The meetings with senators, the payments from foreign agents, the preparations for those contests. But what I remember most is her face in the quiet moments, how empty her eyes were, as if all that pleasure and power couldn't fill the void inside her." The religious implications of her behavior sparked fierce debate among Rome's priests and philosophers. Had she been possessed by demons? Was she a punishment sent by the gods for Rome's growing decadence? Or was she simply what happened when human nature was given absolute freedom to pursue its darkest impulses? "She was like Pandora," declared the high priest of Jupiter in a public ceremony meant to purify the city after her death. "She opened a box that should have remained sealed, releasing evils into the world that we are still struggling to contain. May the gods forgive us for allowing such corruption to flourish in the very heart of the empire." But even as Rome struggled to come to terms with the Messalina affair, new scandals were already brewing. Her death had created a power vacuum that other ambitious women were eager to fill. Agrippina, Claudius's niece who would become his next wife, had watched the rise and fall of her predecessor with calculating eyes, learning valuable lessons about both the potential and the perils of feminine ambition. Messalina's mistake, Agrippina would later confide to her son Nero, was that she was too obvious, too crude in her methods. True power lies not in shocking the world but in controlling it so subtly that it never realizes it's being controlled. The legacy of Messalina would shape Roman imperial politics for generations. Future emperors would be more suspicious of their wives, more careful about the independence they allowed to the women of their households. The position of Empress, which had been gradually gaining in prominence and influence, was suddenly hedged with new restrictions and constant surveillance. "She has made it harder for all of us," complained Livia, the widow of Augustus, in one of her final letters. "Every empress who follows will be judged not by her own merits, but by comparison to that woman's excesses. She has poisoned the well for generations of imperial women to come." Yet there were some who saw in Messalina's story a different kind of lesson, not about the dangers of female ambition, but about the consequences of denying women legitimate channels for their intelligence and drive. These voices were few and often anonymous, but they planted seeds that would eventually grow into more systematic critiques of Roman patriarchal society. "If she had been born male," one anonymous chronicler wrote, "her ambition might have made her a great general or administrator. Instead, she was born female in an age that offered women only two paths to power, through their wombs or their bedchambers. She chose the latter and pushed it to its ultimate extreme. Perhaps the real tragedy is not what she became, but what she might have been." And so the story of Valeria Messalina became more than just a tale of imperial scandal. It became a mirror in which Roman society saw reflected its own contradictions, hypocrisies, and hidden desires. She had held up a dark glass to the empire's soul and forced it to confront truths about power, corruption, and human nature that it would have preferred to ignore. In the end, perhaps that was her greatest achievement and her most lasting legacy, not the empire she nearly seized, but the empire she forced to examine itself. Long after her death, her name would continue to be invoked whenever Romans gathered to discuss the prices and perils of absolute power, the corruption of prosperity, and the eternal question of what happens when human desire is freed from the constraints of law, morality, and common sense. Her story serves as an eternal reminder that in the game of power, there are no rules except victory or death, and that sometimes the most dangerous opponent is the one who refuses to acknowledge that the game has any rules at all. But more than that, it reminds us that behind every scandal lies a human being, however flawed, who believed they were playing to win in the only way they knew how.